So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and this is the virtual reading group of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. It's always exciting to start something new. For those of you who are lovers of Hannah Arendt, you know the joy of the new. And Today we're starting a new book, The Promise of Politics. It's a book that was edited by Jerome Cohn, who is been for many years now the literary executor of Hannah Arendt's estate. Was her last research assistant, and it's a great book. It's one of my favorites in many ways. Some of the essays in here are some of her best. Um, it's also a project that emerged out of this very fertile period that we've been talking about in the early 1950s, that many of the essays in Essays in Understanding that we've read were written during this period. And while those essays focused on the question of, many of them, not all of them, but many of them, on the question of totalitarianism and rethinking totalitarianism, you began to see, I think, in some of the later of those essays, a new concern of Arendt's emerge, with political action and freedom, and obviously those had been already present in the origins of totalitarianism, but not thematized to the same extent. And so she begins working in this period on a new book. Calls it many things. It has to do with Karl Marx. It has to do with the break of tradition. It has to do with her increasing worry about the threat to action, and the way in which action has been displaced from the world, and action becomes another word for politics in many ways. And so this book, which he calls The Promise of Politics, has a number of texts in it which are written around this period in the mid 1950s, prior to the publication of The Human Condition, which we'll read next, which are starting to and trying to think through the way that the philosophical tradition of the West, that begins more or less with Plato and Aristotle, is actually a tradition that for Arendt displaces politics and is a threat to politics. And the end of this tradition, which she says in a sense happens with Karl Marx, is leaves us at this moment of, where do we go? What's going forward? And so that's what the texts in this book are about. The main text, in many ways, the longest one, and the one we'll spend the most time on, is the last one, Introduction into Politics. This is, again, something that Jerry put together from a number of different manuscripts, but I think it was part of a book project that she never finished. All of this was part of a book project that she never finished, and we will. I think these will be exciting texts for you to read over the next few months. The first one is on Socrates, and we should say that when Arendt writes about Socrates, and this is true for almost everyone she writes about in some way, but I think especially for someone like Socrates, she's to a certain extent writing about herself, which is not to say that Arendt thinks she's Socrates. I'm sorry if that came out wrong, but it does, I think, mean that Arendt thinks of Socrates as the kind of political thinker who is engaged in the project of discovering the relevance of thinking for politics, that I think Arendt sees herself as. And so when she talks about Socrates, she's reading him as she reads everybody strongly with her own viewpoints, and bringing out, in many ways, a lot of her own. Um, Jerry appends before the whole volume, and before the Socrates essay, a quote from, the Denktagebuch, the book of thoughts that Arendt started keeping in 1950. And this is an excerpt from 1951. And Arendt begins this excerpt with this idea of, in the moment of action, annoyingly enough, it turns out first that the absolute, that which is above the senses, the true, good, and beautiful, is not graspable. Excuse me. This idea that the absolute is a moment of action, or that in the moment of action, the absolute is not graspable, is really the key, maybe, to this whole book. And so it's really wonderful that Jerry Cohen put it here at the beginning. There's three catastrophes, she says, that come about from the loss of this moment of action. That in the moment of action, the absolute is not graspable. The first catastrophe is that thinkers want to then take control of action, and make action fit truth or thinking. The second catastrophe is that the moment of the absolute, which is supposed to be ungraspable, in the sense of not being anything, comes to be almost anything. Anything can become the absolute, and we can make, as she says here, race the absolute, or classlessness, or the decadence of the bourgeoisie an absolute. Anything goes. And the third is that if you aim at any one end absolutely, for example, justice, you justify the most unjust and bestial actions. So to realize philosophy, that is to realize the absolute, abolishes philosophy. Philosophy in the other sense of the unspeakability and singularity of the absolute. And I think it's in that final sentence that you see the overarching argument, I think, of the whole book, but certainly of the Socrates essay. There's two different ideas of philosophy, right, that she's here talking about. One is philosophy as truth, as the search for an absolute, as the demand that we impose our truth, an objective idea of who we are on all people and on the moment of action. And then another idea of philosophy, which she's going to attribute to Socrates. So the first one she's going to attribute to the Platonic tradition. And the second one she's going to attribute to Socrates and the Socratic tradition, where philosophy is not about truth and not about the absolute, but is about the moment, the holding open of a moment of encountering what one doesn't know, that one doesn't know, and seeking to build a friendship or a community or collectivity with and amongst yourself and others who are people who don't know and who have their own truth, and finding a way to build something together with people with whom we are fundamentally different. And so I think it's really helpful to look at this epigraph because it contains the whole. The essay Socrates, she writes she has numerous passages on Socrates throughout her work, um, and they're somewhat related. This is, I think, the most concentrated one. Although in the Life of the Mind, she repeats much of this as well. Part one and the first step of the essay is simply to say that Plato and Aristotle became the beginning of philosophy. Not that they were the first philosophers, but they became the beginning of a kind of philosophy at a very particular time, at a time when Greece and politics in Greece was decaying. And that's not accidental. It's not unimportant because they became philosophers and began philosophy at a time of the decay of politics. The question they asked was, how can man live outside of politics? How can we live as men outside of the political sphere, to turn man into a kind of thinking being in this abstract sense? And this itself emerged out of the trial of Socrates as an event, which she said, first of all, led to the despair of politics, namely the despair that politics could, that philosophers could live in a world of politics. And it also led to the doubt in the political art extraordinaire, namely persuasion. The fact that Socrates failed to persuade his jurors is, for Plato, reason to doubt persuasion. And persuasion, from Pythane, or Pytho, the goddess of persuasion, is for Arendt the political form of speech. And so Plato, in doubting persuasion, comes to denounce doxa and opinion. Doxa, the Greek word for opinion. And he sets truth against doxa. This setting of truth against doxa is partly to respond to a prejudice that he sees amongst the many, the people, which is that the many think of the philosophers as wise but not understanding. And the quintessential example is Thales, the man who stares up at the stars and walks and falls into a well. And so for Plato, we need to respond to this distrust of the philosopher amongst the many by distrusting doxa and setting truth over and against it. And so Plato responds with what Arendt calls the tyranny of truth, the need to impose an eternal truth on men of which they cannot be persuaded. You can't persuade the many of truth, because as soon as truth enters the marketplace, and this is a fundamental Arendtian idea that comes up in many of her essays, and we've talked about a lot, when truth enters the world, it becomes an opinion. Another way of saying it is that there's no truth in politics. As soon as what you think of as a truth becomes, when you try and convince other people of it, it becomes an opinion that they can have other opinions of. And Plato's view is none of this. We then have to, if we can't persuade, we have to force people to be free in a Rousseauian sense, with force and violence. Socrates, for Arendt, has a different view, right? Socrates also sought to bring truth into the polis, philosophy into the polis, but he entered the polis not as a wise man in possession of truth. He didn't want to impose his truth. He didn't want to rule. He entered the polis as a man with opinions, but he has a very particular opinion. And the Socratic opinion is that there is no truth in politics, first of all. But more importantly, he has another two opinions, which is that one should know thyself, know who one is, know one's own opinion, and one should be free from contradictions. And this is in many ways, this is, I think, the core of this essay, and really so much of the core of understanding Hannah Arendt as a political thinker. Socrates saw doxa as a dulce moi, what shows itself to me. Now, Arendt makes an important distinction here, one we've talked about before, especially in her discussion of Jaspers, for those of you who read Men in Dark Times with us. The dulce moi, what shows itself to me, is not subjective. It's not simply my, what I feel like. It's not arbitrary. It's not a fantasy. But it's also not absolute. It's not objective. It's what she'll call singular. It's the world that opens up to me as who I am. And it's thus going to be different for every person, And so what Socrates says is the philosopher enters the public sphere not to rule by truth, as Plato would, but to make citizens more truthful. This is on page 15. To improve their doxa. He says not to educate, but to improve. And I think that's an important distinction. Again, not in the words. I mean, I think we could quibble over her use of educate and improve, but I want us to understand the importance of the distinction. When she says not to educate, but to improve, she means not to teach people what the truth is. As she says in her essay, Crisis in Education, education has a bad taste in politics, because as soon as you start talking about educating people and educating voters and educating the masses, it makes it seem like you know what they need to learn. And so she says education sounds a bit like brainwashing, as she says in that essay on Crisis in Education. But what does she mean by improve? She means to teach them to know themselves, first of all, to help them see what they actually know, to act as a midwife and pull out of them their truth. And the second thing that we mean by improving, by philosophy entering the public world, not educating, but improving, is teaching people to be free from contradiction. And this is the key for Arendt. To be free from contradiction means that you understand where your own doxa contradicts itself, and where it contradicts yourself. So much of the problems of politics today, let me speak as me, is not that people disagree, right? It's that not only do people disagree, but they won't be consistent, self-consistent. They won't listen to who they are and then be consistent with that, and they'll manipulate their own opinions and not be true to themselves. This is, I think, an Arendtian idea here. So she says that to be free from contradiction means to learn how to be a friend to oneself. Friendship is the equalization of unequals in politics. It's an equal partnership in a common world. Friends see the world from the other's point of view. The great politician on page 17 again sees the world from the greatest number of viewpoints. And thus friendship, she says, is higher than justice. What does that mean to say friendship is higher than justice? Well, if justice is a truth or an ideal, you don't need justice amongst friends. Why? Because amongst friends, we can disagree. We can see that there are different truths and understand each other and come to treat each other as equals amidst our difference and our inequality. Now, let me just say a few words about this idea of a common world of friends. Does that mean, as it might, that it's a world of a particular viewpoint, of a particular, and does it exclude certain people, whether it's race or class or education, right? And I think that's an absolutely essential question to ask. Insofar as Arendt says that the very effort of philosophy in the public world, political philosophy, the point of political philosophy is to improve people, not educate them, improve them. What does that mean? Help them know themselves and help them learn to be friends with themselves and others, to be friends with themselves in the sense of not contradicting themselves and open themselves to plurality, and thus create a common world. Well, what does that mean, a common world? Does it mean we all agree? No, not at all. And so every common world will include prejudices. They can, again, be racial prejudices, class prejudices, educational prejudices, and many others, religious prejudices, etc. Every common world will have prejudices. And what a philosopher does in entering a political world is to, again, help us know ourselves and thus our prejudices, and help us to not contradict ourselves and understand, therefore, where our prejudices might actually be leading us to contradict ourselves. And so virtue, she says, can be taught. And what this means, this is on page 23, virtue can be taught. And what this means is that we can think and act and be more true to ourselves and not contradict ourselves and be better persons. We can learn to overcome our prejudices, not by being told they're wrong by some philosopher or some whatever, but by being taught by a philosopher to confront ourselves and our contradictions. And thus, she says, man is not a rational being, he is a thinking being. And it's in solitude, in this practice of thinking with myself and understanding that I am plural, that I learn how to be a friend both to myself and others. She says on page, I think it's on page 24, sorry. She says, we, on the other hand, who have had the experience with totalitarian mass organizations, and I'll focus on that because we talked a little bit last week about the we and what she means, who says a we. Well, here she says who the we is. We who have the experience of totalitarian mass organizations. We who have experienced that, or we who have sought to understand those who have experienced that. We understand that one of the great dangers of totalitarianism is the removal of solitude, and thus the removal of the capacity to think and think from the perspective of others. And that is what, for her, political philosophy is. The last part of the essay is an analysis of Plato, right? And it's an analysis of Plato that, on the one hand, sees Plato as a danger, as sort of setting in motion this tradition of philosophy that seeks truth, that therefore can encapsulate the absolute and do away with this moment of openness, the moment of action in which the absolute cannot be actualized. And yet she says that for Plato, the turn towards the truth, right? The turn towards the idea and the world of ideas actually begins with this idea of thaumedzane, of wonder. And what is wonder, she asks. And she now develops an idea of wonder against Plato, a Socratic idea of wonder, that it's the endurance of being seized by the rapture of questioning, of not knowing the truth, of being a questioning being. So wonder as truth and openness is both stands against truth in the sense of knowledge, a philosophical knowledge, but also against truth as doxa, when doxa doesn't question itself and doesn't question its own prejudices. And so Socratic philosophy is the philosophy that has no clear doxa and finds all doxa intolerable, including the truth. And thus she'll say on page 37 that Plato's mistake is to take this experience of wonder, this experience of the moment of action, this experience of entering the polis as a questioning being, and generalizing that experience, that singular experience of wonder, and making it into an experience outside the polis of philosophy in a non-worldly profession. And it's that that, in a sense, fixing of wonder so that it is apolitical and that it leads then to a kind of truth, yardsticks and standards and measurements, which could measure politics and measure the human affairs. That is the beginning of the Western tradition of political philosophy, which she says ends in Marx, who tries to find yardsticks and measures of philosophy, not from ideas, but from the material foundations of society. And it's against this tradition that she's holding out this idea that what philosophy can be as useful as is that constantly entering into the public sphere to wonder at plurality and improve people, teach, not educate, teach, improve people, talk to people in such a way that we help them come to see their own truth, who they are, as a singular truth, but also challenge them anytime that truth becomes orthodoxy, set into a kind of true doxa. And that's how, I think, how she imagines Socrates, and really how she imagines her own role as a political thinker in the world. So I see there's already a bunch of questions, hands up. I'm going to stop there and open this up. So Mara, are you around?
Hi, yes, I am. I had to unmute myself. I'm going to leave the issue of truth and doxa, which I find, problematic to anchor. But I wanted to point one thing about the principle of non-contradiction, because on the one hand, it seems kind of intuitively sound, but on the other hand, it disregards, I don't want to say human nature, but the fact that we are, contradicting human beings. I don't want to sound too psychoanalytic on this, but this is part of the problematic of politics. So in this principle of non-contradiction, as she's pointing, and someone made a comment, it is the same thing that she criticized and points out as the danger of replacing thinking, with the logic of totalitarianism. And I don't know the way out, actually. It may be that Arendt takes this stand and we're somewhere in between, as she would. I don't know what she would, actually. But I don't know, for me, it's very problematic. I understand what she's saying, that you cannot contradict yourself, but at the same time, that is actually not empirically
So
true.
Mara, let me just make one quick correction.
Yeah.
You absolutely can contradict yourself. She's very clear about that. As she's so on page 20, she'll say, insofar as I am one, I will not contradict myself, but I can contradict myself because in thought I am two in one. So
Yes.
therefore
I
I do
was.
not only live with others as one, but also with myself. The fear of contradiction is part and parcel of splitting up, of no longer remaining one. And this is the reason why the axiom of contradiction could become the fundamental rule of thought. This is also the reason why plurality of men can never be abolished, right? So from her point of view, we are contradictory beings. We are at our root, insofar as we think, we are contradictory beings.
But she
Yeah.
believes that you can become one. I was gonna get to that point. Like, she believes that we can become one vis-a-vis others, and that moment of oneness, and I'm talking about oneness in the sense of non-contradiction, you know, is achievable and possible. For some it is, but it's not. But I don't think you can assume that for everybody. That's what I'm saying, that she assumes that the moment of oneness and non-contradiction vis-a-vis others is possible. And you alluded to that when you said there's, you know, contradiction. If I understood correctly, I was just listening, you know, that the problems with right now, you gave your own opinion, was that. And I think that there's also the issue related to this between speech and thought that she poses as identity, and I don't think that that's a given either.
So
I don't know whether, yeah.
you said you said something. You said like you have to appear as one, and then you added two others, right? Which is right. Which is what she's saying is in the world, we all appear as an individual, as one, but no one is one. Um, uh, the the importance of the two in one, the dialogue of solitude, I think is doubled, right? So on the one hand, it gives me the experience of being with myself, someone with whom I may not always agree. And so it becomes an experience of living with others. Um, it also allows me, insofar as I am in dialogue with my other self, my friend, to have to figure out who I am. And, I don't think who I am is ever going to be a simple thing. Maybe some, I don't know. But she says there are probably some limits. And who I am, if I am a murderer, that may be someone I don't want to live with. It may not be. Maybe I can live with myself as a murderer, but she would like to think one can't. And so, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think when she says that we have that what Socrates offers is to be oneself and to not contradict oneself. She's not saying be a simple, a simple person without contradictions at all. She's saying that I have to learn who I am, and if I am, a a decent person, let's say that's who I think I am, I have to learn that certain things that I may do, or that I may think, whether it's that rich people are awful, or Jews are bad, or certain races are inferior, I have to come to terms with that's a contradiction, and I can't be who I am as long as I hold those opinions.
But
So
that is actually,
I take that to be
sorry.
the point here, and that the
Yeah,
philosopher is one who comes into the world and challenges me about the contradictions in my opinions and the way that my opinions are confused, and makes me think in moments of action.
I still find it problematic because the being one vis-a-vis others, and this is the last thing I'm gonna say because I don't want to monopolize, but the being one vis-a-vis others, like that fleeting identity. I mean, what's the value of, let's say, that fleeting identity? Let's say that you appear as one, and like 5 minutes later, you appear as a different one, right? So there you're seeing a contradiction between you and yourself in appearance as well. I don't want to set it as a time frame, but I don't think that you can actually really, or many times, become one. And in terms of the, I don't want to live with a murderer, Arendt is leaving out psychopaths, right? She's assuming their Kantian morality, be my actions, that you can elevate them as like a universal law. And that's not a given either. So she's just putting like under the carpet, right, these normative assumptions. That's what I'm gonna say. Thank you, Roger. I'm gonna mute
Mara,
myself.
thank you. We'll move on. Rick. Oh, there's a lot of questions. So we'll try and get through these.
I just have a couple of general comments, but I want to mention something that on top of what Mara said, as far as this idea of contradiction. There was, I think, only one sentence that Arendt says in here that really caught my eye that she doesn't develop, which I find really interesting. But if we take like the law of contradiction, which like A cannot be B, A cannot be A and B at the same time. That's basically like the law of contradiction. We take that as like a logical law, right? But Arendt says, well, actually, this so-called logical law is really just a product of a more originary idea of contradiction living with yourself. And that, I think, is a really, really interesting idea that deserves a whole other topic by itself. But this idea that living with yourself is this originary position of which all this other stuff grows, I find very attractive. But as far as the essay as itself, I think you could divide it into three sections that I'll try to go through really quickly. And I think you can really see her influence from her teacher in this and in all her works. I take that to be a very positive thing. But in the beginning, I think she wants to address, not what did Plato say, but what does Socrates say, which could be something very different than what Plato says. And I think what she's saying is that Plato, in a certain sense, corrupted, well, not in a certain sense, but that Plato did corrupt Socrates' thought for, in Plato's eyes, a good reason. But I think she wants to get back and say, well, what was going on with Socrates here that we kind of lost in our tradition? And let's see what that nugget is and open it up and what we could do with it. Because with this whole tradition, I think what she wants to say is that, the idea of politics or political thought has exhausted itself. And what we need to do is to somehow not go back to the beginning, but somehow to see the beginning in new eyes. And she has that line in one of the other essays we read a few weeks ago. But with this tradition, it basically boils down to is, do we see political thing? And political, I think, just means, how we live with others in the marketplace. It has nothing to do with parties or government. It's how we live together, kind of thing. I take that to be what she means by politics. And, we can either see, philosophical ideas through the eyes of politics, or we can see politics through the eye of philosophy. And Socrates, I think she says, saw it the former way. It's politics first, living with others, of which everything else grows. Plato perverted that, turned it around because he didn't like seeing his teacher put to death. So how can we stop this from happening? So we have to put the city, state, and politics under the rule of philosophy, the eternal laws. And I think she sees that as the initial step of going down this path. I hate to say it's the wrong path because that's an excuse not to read these guys, and she would not like that at all. but it's a path that has exhausted itself. It has worn itself out. And that's why I think in the end she says, now it's a question to get into politics with something different. So I think in the beginning thing, she wants to resurface and unpack what got covered up with Socrates. The second piece that she quickly says is this idea that this contradiction between politics and philosophy actually is a product of another more primary contradiction, which is Plato's body and soul. Except in that body and soul, we also have this idea of rulership. The soul rules the body. So now we have this idea of rulership, which has potential problems all over the place, enters into the game. Instead of people showing themselves in the marketplace, we have this idea of rulership entering the marketplace. And then the last part of the essay, Roger, that you said, is the idea of wonder, which I is a great, beautiful wonder, wonderful concept. And she's saying that the thing Plato didn't do in his analogy of the cave is that he didn't explain, well, why is it people, if they're sitting in the basement, binge watching Netflix all day, why the heck do they want to get out of their chairs and go outside in the world?
Right.
It's because of the idea of wonder. And that's what she wants to put on a table, is this idea of wonder, which is always the primary thing that turns us into questionable beings. The fact that we ask, how can I live with my neighbor, can only come about because me as a questionable being, I wonder before that, what does it mean to be a human, kind of thing. And the problem with philosophy is said, skip all this middle mash, living with neighbor stuff. What is the nature of being? That's where the real guts of the matter is. And that, of course, is a big problem of Arendt, because Arendt, of course, hates ideology.
Thanks, Rick.
And that's the sum.
Okay. I'll take that, I guess, as a comment. I don't know if there was a question. Dina, go on.
My question is, how do you square the role of philosophers to help us overcome our contradictions with the idea on page 27?
Say that, Dina, say that again. You speak a little more loudly, or I just turned my volume up. I'm sorry.
My question is, how do you square the role of philosophers to help us overcome our contradictions with the idea that the contradiction between politics and philosophy is inherent to philosophers, as she says on page 27?
Well, I don't think it's inherent to all philosophers. I think it's inherent to philosophers in the tradition of Plato. But where do you see that, just so I know?
I don't think it's limited to Plato. I think it applies to Socrates just as much. It's at the bottom towards the end of 27, the philosopher, although you're right that the discussion that precedes this sentence is about Plato, but I don't think necessarily that it's limited to Plato. The philosopher, although he perceives something that is more than human, that is divine, remains a man. So the conflict between philosophy and the affairs of men is ultimately a conflict within the philosopher himself.
Yeah.
So if there's an inherent conflict in the philosopher, how do you square that with what you said was the philosopher's role, the second part of the philosopher's role, which is to resolve or help us overcome our contradictions?
The difference is that Plato takes that conflict, right, and generalizes it, right, makes it a and thinks that the philosopher can, in a sense, inhabit the soul rather than the body, and stand outside of politics. Whereas someone like Socrates, she says, enters the polis not as a wise man, not as a philosopher, but as someone with ideas, with doxa. And so for Socrates, the conflict, he also has the conflict in him. The difference is that he doesn't seek to rationalize and generalize this. He inhabits it and seeks to, in a sense, make other people inhabit it as well, to help them to see this conflict between themselves as philosophers and men of affairs. The point is to make to not simply rule the men of affairs by being a philosopher, but to make all men of affairs, to the extent you can, more philosophical.
Right.
That is more open to questioning.
Right, I agree completely. I'm challenging the idea that Socrates would have tried to help us overcome our contradictions. The contradictions are not actually something that he believes in, or that can be overcome as such. They can't be resolved as such, which is exactly the attempt that was made by Plato by separating us from our bodies and so forth. For Socrates, as far as I understand, based on this essay, the teaching is to face the contradiction, but not necessarily to resolve it and overcome it.
Well, I mean,
To remain open to it is kind of the idea.
I think there's different kind of contradictions that we've talked about. I mean, when we're talking about the conflict between myself as more than human, right, divine, and myself as human, a man, or myself as a philosopher and myself as a man of affairs, right? There's the effort is not to overcome any contradictions. And you know, but and this comes back to Mara's question. The other way is that what does the philosopher do when he or she acts as a midwife, and seeks to help people bring out their ideas of who they are, and thus to make them accord with who they are. It's not to turn them into a computer and thus eliminate their contradictions, right? But it is to help them see their contradictions and help them make their own judgment about who they are and what it would mean to live free from those contradictions, at least as they appear in public. And so there is an important way in which, again, no, you're not going to fully resolve or end all contradictions, but there is an attempt to say that the philosopher is one who helps me to see my contradictions and to see who I am, and helps me to choose to live less contradictorily. Yeah. I don't think that's I think that kind of contradiction is very different from the contradiction that we all have within us, divinity and humanity. I don't think those are the same kinds of contradictions, but yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that we're trying to get fully rid of all contradictions, but I do think the effort here is to are contradictions bad? That's another way to put it, right? On the one hand, no, we all are full of contradictions. On the other hand, if there is what she's trying to say here is that each of us has our own, as both a man and a divine person, each of us has our own singular insight into what is true and just. And insofar as what is true and just is true and just, Arendt is pretty confident that insofar as we have an insight into it, it's worth our trying to be true to our insight into what is true and just. And my insight into what's true and just is not going to be the same as your insight, Dina, into what's true and just. And yet she thinks that what allows us to live together in the world as friends is that we both understand each other as living governed by our insights into what is true and just. And the bigger problems emerge when one or both of us is actually not only differs in our view of what's true and just, but doesn't even live consistently in accord with that, and is filled with contradictions. And that, she says, is what a philosopher can help to, as she says, improve us as citizens and men. If that.
May I jump in?
Clara? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Quickly, but we have a long list of people, so a quick question.
Okay. I would just I'd like to say that the problem with for Arendt is not truth, is when the truth is absolute, unique, unquestionable. So it's not doxa against truth, it's doxa against truth unquestionable, in terms of a questionable. And the other thing that I want to add, Roger, is that living together, what really makes possible to live together is sharing a world. And she insists in that in all her texts. And that's really important, because it's not a question of contradictions or no contradiction. It's sharing a common world. That's what we are. And how we share a common world, because we have a different opinions and a different perspectives. And that's how the world opened to us. And the other thing that I was going to say is that I don't think the role of us philosophers, I'm a philosopher.
Clara.
A political philosopher, let me finish, Roger, it's just a second. It's not to overcome or to help people overcome contradictions. I don't agree with that. And I'm sure that that's not Arendt's point of view, but in terms of plurality, I just say that.
Okay. I hear what you're saying. I think Arendt's saying is that is her point of view. I mean, again, if we understand, I think what she's saying is that a philosopher, a political philosopher, is not to impose truth. It is to help people think what they are doing. It's another way to put it. That's another way of saying, I think, in this case, to know yourself and to cure yourself of the contradictions. I think there's, I think the word with contradictions seems to be, having luggage here or baggage, which for a lot of us that I don't think Arendt means to have. She's not saying with curing or improving or getting rid of contradictions, getting rid of making everyone simple or thoughtless or anything like that.
But Roger, it's not about curing contradictions. It's Sam. That's not what she's saying. We can't cure contradictions, right? So there's distinction to will, right? And this contradiction relates to oneness. When we have internal contradiction, which is the will, which is not in harmony ever, and it's constantly being pulled in multiple directions. And then when we act in the world, we repair that because we have to decide. And then we appear as one, not as two in one that's being torn apart. And thinking requires self-harmony. It's not, we don't repair contradiction. And this is actually related to
and we don't overcome it.
You know, we can't, and it would be undesirable to overcome it. She says that, you know, the fear of contradiction is what actually makes men susceptible to ideology and tyrannical thinking. And so we have to learn how to embrace inner contradictions as a weight in the soul.
I agree with
again,
you.
I think you guys, I think there's a misunderstanding of the way she's using contradiction here. There's no desire to say that from her point of view that we want to make people, you know, simple or without contradiction in the sense that some of you and Sam and others are saying. What does she say when she says that that Socrates says it is better to be in disagreement with the whole world than being one to be in disagreement with myself, right? what is it that she's trying to say there? She says there's two insights that that Socrates has, which he believed show the political function of the philosopher. This is on page on 18. The first insight, which she then describes on page 19, is to know thyself, right? And for Socrates, this knowing thyself includes knowing that I do not know. The second insight, she says, is that it is better to be in disagreement with the whole world than being one to be in disagreement with myself. Now, she's going to then say, obviously, we're all two in one. She's not trying to say get rid of contradiction in that sense. So, and as Sam said, the fear of contradiction comes from the fact that each of us is from 19 to 20, being one can at the same time talk with himself as though he were two, because I'm already two in one. So what does it mean, therefore, to not be in disagreement with myself for her? It means, she says, the condition is that he be of one mind with himself, in agreement with himself, because somebody who contradicts himself is unreliable. The faculty of speech and the fact of human plurality correspond to each other, not only in the sense that I use words for communication with those with whom I am together in the world, but in even the most relevant sense of speaking with myself, I live together with myself. So, so when she says to not contradict oneself, another way of framing that is to be reliable, right? To not be unreliable. And so what does that mean, to not be unreliable or to be reliable? And how is it that, as she says, the whole frame of this is, how is it that this is, that the political function of the philosopher is to help establish a common world on these two insights of know thyself and to be reliable. That's the question she's asking. I take the point to be not that we want to get rid of the two in one, or get rid of the fact that we are, that we contain multitudes, that there are contradictions, or that there's plurality. Not at all. But it's that we be reliable. And what does that mean? It means that insofar as we have insight into the divine, into that we have a singular sense of who we are and what is right, we aim to live up to that and be reliable in the name of that. And the philosopher, as the midwife, has, I think, two jobs in the public sphere for her. The Socratic philosopher. One is to pull out of each one of us to help us see our singular vision of our divinity, of who we are, our singular vision of what it means, of who I am and what I should be. And two, to show us where we fall short, to show us where we're unreliable, to show us where we contradict that vision that we have of ourselves, that singular vision, that is our vision, that is doke moi, that is what I see. Yeah, I'll stop there. I don't know if that helps or not.
It does help.
Sam, do you want to respond? Sam, you're muted.
Yeah. I think at this point it might be better to move on in the conversation. I'm happy to come back to this point later. I think Arendt's understanding of thinking and the role of the midwife and bringing the new into being through the process of thinking, I think there's a lot going on here. And I think, you know, you can read it in this kind of flat way as a way of holding the self accountable, and personal responsibility is certainly something that she has in mind, and how we hold ourselves accountable to power outside of us. But I think she's also thinking about our faculties in thinking, and the relationship between our conscience and our self-consciousness, and that dialogue that we carry on, which requires both harmony and discord. And, you know, there's this, you know, I always read this part as, you know, the underpinning question of, is there a way of thinking that's not tyrannical? This 2 in 1 is this space of dialogue for thinking that she creates, which is different from action. But I think people in the chat want to move on. So
okay, David, you're up.
So absorbed in the discussion. I've got a few points to make, but I can make them quite briefly. First of all, the idea of the midwife is, of course, one that, and in some ways, a psychoanalyst sees themselves not as telling a person who they are, but as helping them discover who they are. As one analyst put it, beyond the aim of analysis is to introduce someone to the most important person they'll ever meet, namely themselves. But there are perversions of psychoanalysis which do turn it into something like a tyranny. You know, the analyst who knows, who'll tell you, and so on. So I just wanted to mention that. But in the two other things I want to say is, firstly, as I think about it, it's coming back to the issue of contradiction, really. If one accepts that one is always in contradiction with oneself, accepting it can be very bad news, because that's like a postmodernist shrug. So you have to recognize it, struggle against it, try to resolve it, but know that you never can. So it's an ongoing, constant tension, which doesn't ever resolve itself. And I think this way of capturing something in movement all the time, the tension in thought, is a way of steering away from a kind of, you know, opinions are just a matter of taste, so it's what you fancy, or a kind of tyrannical, empirical kind of positivism. But so there's always that tension. But I'm just emphasizing that accepting can't be a casual acceptance. It's a very painful, continuous struggle. And the related to that maybe is the idea that what Arendt is talking about exists on one domain, and these domains are just different domains. They're not, I don't think they can really map onto each other. But of course, from where I'm coming from, which is also is that people can't come to understand themselves just by acts of will. It also involves modes of being in the world. And those modes might be through help, but they might be through community, family, whatever it is. But it can't just be the cognitivist attempt to overcome, although that has to exist too, because there is resistance. And the resistance is connected with the psychic pain that coming to know the self involves. So I think that needs emphasis. And the last thing is this: although we cannot ever find truths, we do find less untruthfulness. And I think that's important. So that if, for example, a person lives in a world in which their whole perspective of the world, the way I put it is their framing of the world, is say, who's up and who's down. That's a very common one. And they come to see that frame, that way of judging the world, and see that that's only one way of being in the world, then their perspective is widened and they're less untruthful. Not they found some ultimate truth, because then there'll be other frames to find. But I think it's a struggle to be less untruthful.
Yeah, I like that. And I think, you know, I think and I also like what you said. I think I take very to heart what you said about you want to let people speak, but you also don't want to just be wishy-washy. And I think that's very much the Socratic idea here that Arendt is bringing out, right? That you want to hold people to their true insight, their singular true insight. And part of that singular true insight that you're going to hold people to is the openness of the absolute, and thus the questioning of all doxa, or at least of all orthodoxy. And I think that that is, I mean, I think you have to read this with the rest of the book in mind, which is a discussion of prejudices and how we do and do not respond to prejudices, which is another word for for sort of orthodoxies. So I do think it's important for us to hold in mind that the philosopher enters the world to always be in the polis and to remind people of the need for wonder, and thus of solitude, and thus of enduring that wonder, and not falling back into a kind of orthodoxy that defines the common world. I'm going to move on because we got a lot of hands up. Steve Greenleaf.
Okay. I want to ask about a sentence. It's on page 23. She wrote, to Socrates, man is not yet a rational animal, a being endowed with the capacity of reason, but a thinking being whose thought is manifest in the manner of speech. She seems to be opposing here and elsewhere a distinction between rationality and reason and thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we've been talking a lot about self-contradiction, which to me is in some manner a way of reasoning, a rational way of thought. So is there a distinction here she's making? And if so, what does thinking consist of for her? I know it is conducted by the internal dialogue with oneself, but if it's not reason and rationality, what is it? What does it consist of?
Right. So this is a distinction that runs through much of her thought, Steve. I'm hearing someone's radio or something in the background. So if you have a radio on or if there's something going on, please mute yourself. Can somebody mute whoever's speaking?
It's Ken. Ken, if you can hear me, can you please mute?
I muted. All right, I muted him. Thanks. Oh no. Ken who? Ken, can you mute yourself? All right. Reason, comes from the Latin ratio. It's a kind of calculative reasoning.
Alex, it's Alex whose mic is not muted.
Alex? Who's Alex? Oh, I see. All right. No, it is muted. All right. That's good. Thank you for whoever muted it. Thanks, Daphne. Sorry. So reason is a kind of calculation, and it's often kinds of, for Arendt, means ends oriented reasoning. And it seeks to have achievements, whereas thinking for her, again, she writes a lot about it. There's a number of properties or characteristics of thinking. One is that it doesn't have an end per se. Two is that it's this two in one. It's a conversation. Three, it tries to think from the perspective of others, not, and thus Another one is that it doesn't seek truth, whereas reason often seeks truth. It seeks what she calls meaning. So those are some basic characteristics of thinking which distinguish it from reasoning in her work. There are more, something she writes a lot about, but I think that should do it here. Is that all right, Steve? Or do you have a more particular question?
No, I think that does address it, and that helps me tease out those terms as she uses them, which, yes, I've noticed she uses very frequently, and sometimes I get a little uncertain, but that helps a good deal. Thank you.
Thank you. John, you're next.
I want to suggest that Leo Tolstoy in Anna Karenina, at the back end of the book, it would be part 8, Levin goes through a stream of consciousness which captures this entire dialogue of conflict, contradiction, which can be very helpful in understanding Hannah Arendt, in my opinion. And the whole idea that almost that we're all a philosopher and a politician simultaneously, and that many times we do not know, but we have instinctively the possibility of knowing how to act. And in in Tolstoy's writing, I think you will find exactly what we're discussing, these contradictions, these inconsistencies, and then the ability to intuitively act.
Now I love Tolstoy, but it's been a while, so I'll take that as a comment, and thank you.
It is a comment. It's, if anyone's interested, it's in part 8, chapters 10 through 11, and the stream of consciousness deals exactly with what we're discussing, his internal, Levin's internal conflict, and how he resolves his circumstances, which is very parallel to many of the thoughts we've heard, in my opinion.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Nancy Felsen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I have, whenever Hannah Arendt uses Plato and Socrates and talks about what Plato thinks, I have trouble because there's so much debate within interpretations of the dialogues about where the character Socrates, who is a perhaps fictionalized construction of the philosopher Socrates, leaves off, and where Plato's opinions begin. And I see, like, your early thought about how she is using, how she's expressing her own conceptual framework using Plato and Aristotle and using Socrates. I get that. And if I suspend my classicist's finickiness about that issue of a character versus a real person, I get it. I can follow it pretty well, but that does bother me about her. It's almost like she reduces, well, I mean, maybe she's just on a different level teasing out what Plato is doing dramatically in each of the dialogues, but it's very hard to accept that there is a Plato voice and that there is a Socrates voice that you can separate in such a stark way. So it's perhaps a question, perhaps content, comment, I don't know.
Nancy, I take that to heart. I grew up in the intellectual world reading Heidegger, right? That was my introduction to thinking. And Heidegger is a brilliant reader of the history of philosophy, and yet suddenly everyone in the history of philosophy becomes Heideggerian in reading Heidegger. And he's incredibly brilliant and convincing in making them Heidegger. But you know they're not. And yet he brings out the unsaid and the unthought in these thinkers to make them say and think what he sees them as doing. And it's an extraordinary performance. You can learn a ton about them and him, but you also have to realize it's not the same. Arendt reads the history of philosophy very much like Heidegger. Again, she's a brilliant reader of Plato and a brilliant reader of Marx and a brilliant reader of all these folks. But she is mining them to find in them what is unsaid and unthought by them sometimes, to make them, to have them in conversation with her. That's the kind of, when you're that kind of thinker, you can do that. And so, is Plato only a thinker of the tyranny of reason over the politics? No. You can do readings of Plato that turn him around and make him an anti-tyrannical thinker. And sometimes Arendt does that with Plato. But she's reading to tell a story. And so I would say, on the one hand, never dismiss Arendt's readings of figures in the history of philosophy. They're brilliant readings and they're not wrong, but they're never simple, one-sided. And we should be aware of that. And I think it's a good point to bring up. Jack,
can I just add something? This is in response to David Bell's interesting remarks about a psychiatrist's role compared to, say, Socrates' role as Plato depicts him, which is that I've always had the problem in teaching some of the dialogues of whether Socrates' statement of that he knows that he does not know, that he knows he's not an absolute, that he's not in possession of absolute knowledge, whether that's it's a disarming position to take, but the whole question of hierarchy, I also find true in the psychiatrist's room. There is a sense in which probably a psychotherapist has to constantly work on not delivering his truth to the analysand or to the patient. And I think that with Socrates, it's very ambiguous in many of the dialogues as to whether he is claiming a position of authority that's at a different hierarchical level. So I guess my question is, that whole notion that there's real dialogicality between one human and another is always in tension for me in the dialogues. And it also seems that way in a psychoanalytic setting, that there is a question of balance and so on. I'm sorry if I wasn't. Yeah.
It's a good point. And I mean, you're a classicist, there's Arendt would certainly point to the distinction between what she would call the early dialogues and the later dialogues. And clearly in the middle and late dialogues, this character Socrates is not in dialogue with his interlocutors. He's leading them along, knowing where he's taking them, right? Whereas in the earlier dialogues, there's a little bit more of that in that dialogue. And I think Arendt would point to that, but it's a good point. Okay. Jack, you're up.
Well, I'm sorry to get to take us out of this abstract space, but I'm I'm always in a more historical space, parallel to the development or history of philosophy. There is an actual political history. The world is changing between Plato and Hannah Arendt's time, and a lot of things have happened that it's, oh God damn you, shut up. A lot of things that are happening have happened over time. So I don't want to belabor this, but where my mind goes is that in some ways the history of politics is one in which the individual responsibility, which takes place in the church, in the Reformation, and this is, I'm talking about Europe, of course, the European civilization. And then gets embodied politically in a more advanced state in the Constitution of the United States, where there is an effort really to allow the individual to be the individual being, to function in a social setting, but to maintain his own individual being. And that's the way I see that development. And I think that you know, we talk, we know that we know what happened with Bolshevism, but Marx said you have nothing to lose but your chains. But when Lenin tried to persuade, when he tried to use persuasion, I think very in a very bad conscience, with bad conscience, he said, all power to the Soviets. He said to the farmers, the farms, and to the workers, the factories, which was a much more positive call. And where I'm going with all of this is that I see Hannah Arendt's thinking in this essay. I don't know about the whole book, but in this essay, leading up to the anarchists of the early part of the 20th century, leading up to Occupy, leading up to Black Lives Matter, that is and leading up to the hippie movement of the 60s, leading up to people trying to create political structures that allow for each individual to discover himself or herself and to exercise that selfhood freely in a social setting. And I think the reason this is important to me is that I know that where Hannah Arendt is leading ultimately is to an idea of freedom. And I think that these are expressions of that idea of freedom. These are actual expressions in history of that idea of freedom that her work is leading up to.
Thanks, Jack. I mean, clearly, Arendt wants to free political actors, individuals, activists from a kind of tyranny of ideas or political philosophy that tells them what they should do, whether that be Platonic philosophy or Hobbesian philosophy or Marxist philosophy. And so I think there's a part of what you're saying, which I think is fair, which is that it's to you know, there's certainly a respect for those who act and think. At the same time, I think she's also asking a particular question, which is what is and what is the value of thinking in politics and political thinkers. You know, I think that the hope would be, I mean, I don't, you know, you mentioned a lot of groups, and I think she would be, you know, I think she would be happy that all of these groups are there and acting, but probably hopeful that they would maybe do a little less acting and a little more thinking. And I think that part of this essay is about trying to sort of bridge the gap between the pure actors and the pure thinkers, and see if there's a way to encourage the thinkers to act a little more, and the actors maybe to, and the actors to think a little more.
You know, I think I would agree with you, but when I think about the anarchists of the early part of the 20th century, I think that was as much that was as close as you could get to her sense of how to act politically. That is, they were true to themselves. They certainly respected each other's opinions and the opinions of others. They tried to persuade, but with except for a handful who went off into some violent end. Mostly anarchists were not that way, and who were prepared to go to be imprisoned for maintaining maintaining a kind of personal integrity. And I think that that's a lot. That goes a long way to her vision of how things ought to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly anti-sovereign elements of Arendt's thought, and some would say even anarchist elements of her thought. But I just want to be clear, she herself is not an anarchist, and at least in the sense of those movements. So just, you know, which is not to say that she wouldn't support some of what they do. Stephen. Stephen, are you there? Or Ayala?
I'm here. Thanks, Roger. Sorry. I don't want to get us skipping to the end of the essay if we shouldn't, but I wanted to ask a question about the ending on 38, 39. Would Arendt agree that perhaps philosophy today has achieved the kind of engagement with the realm of human affairs that she was looking for? When you consider the range of sub-disciplines and specialties in philosophy that have perhaps grown since the 1950s in feminist philosophy as a big impetus, but business and professional ethics, medical ethics, Phil of science and Phil of ed and so forth. Is it the case then that contemporary philosophy has gone some distance in the direction that she would want?
I don't think so. You know, the fact that there are sub-disciplines of philosophy and such, does it all mean that philosophy is concerned with well, action in the way she's talking about of making of being in the world and seeking to live amongst the plurality of people. You know, again, I can tell you my experience is mostly people who think they and want to tell other people what the answers are. I'm sure that's not what all philosophers are. I don't want to say it is. But I don't think simply specialization makes philosophy more along the lines of what more political in the way that she would like it to be. The fundamental idea that she says philosophy, political philosophy, has to be able to embrace is the wonder at plurality, and that means the wonder at people who fully disagree and don't share each other's truths and thoughts. Again, I'm sure that's true of some philosophy, but my experience of academic philosophy and of academic life general is not that. But I'm happy to be proven wrong. I mean, I'm not sure if I understood really, maybe I completely misunderstood your account of philosophy, Stephen.
Well, I don't have an account at all. Just the fact that I know that philosophers serve on ethics panels and all that kind of thing. And,
yeah, but they serve as ethics panels, and they often want to tell people what to do.
Well,
I mean,
that may be one way that some people try to act, but that's not the whole picture, as I think you already have agreed.
Yeah, I'm sure, but I guess she says that philosophy will never be able to deny its origin in Thalmud's wonder. But if philosophers, despite their necessary estrangement from the everyday life of human affairs, and now you're saying, well, some of them are getting back into human affairs and sitting on ethics panels and things, right? But despite that, were ever to arrive at a true political philosophy, they would have to make the plurality of man, out of which arises the whole realm of human affairs in its grandeur and misery, the object of their Thalmud's. Biblically speaking, they would have to accept the miracle that God did not create man, but male and female, he created them. They would have to accept in something more than the resignation of human weakness, the fact that it is not good for man to be alone. In other words, they'd have to accept misery and to some degree evil and disagreement and real real plurality. I'm not, again, I'm sure there are some, but that's certainly not my experience of most philosophy and most academic philosophy today.
Right.
Can I say something, Roger?
Yeah.
I have always bristled at the applied ethics fields for the reasons that you state, that the very term implies a position that is going to be applied from a privileged position outside the issue itself. But I do think we should recall, relative to the conversation we had a few weeks back, that there is that strand of pragmatism from James through Dewey and others. I mean, James wrote A Pluralistic Universe, and his model for philosophy was ultimately the Republic. And Dewey wrote The Quest for Certainty. And in many ways, I'm reminded of his argument in that book and elsewhere when we just read this essay. I mean, his take on Plato and the difficulties of the philosophical tradition of the West is very, very much aligned with Arendt. So I think there's a major conversation here that needs to be opened up with regard to Arendt's place within American philosophy.
That's great. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate that. Ayala.
Yeah, I wonder about, still, it looks like we were treating contradictions on different levels.
Back to the contradiction question, okay.
Yeah, and which is, I think, philosophically related to the idea of pluralism, because pluralism necessarily will bring contradictions. But if to take your narrow, Roger, your narrow attempt to define it, which is reliability, the contradictions can narrow down to the phenomenon of hypocrisy or inconsistent behavior, even if it is not hypocritical, not known. And I wonder if philosophy is really an ambitious way to address this issue. The issue with non-reliability between or the contradiction between the way we live and the way we preach, let's say, or think, has to do with more so with psychology, with social psychology, with the culture and the social structure. I mean, rewarding certain behaviors and not others, or certain thinking. But really, is philosophy kind of an ambitious way to address the issue? Because most of the unreliability problem in society, and it is a huge problem, I agree, is a matter of either people having, either the subject having the blind spot versus the objective way that they really appear, or a result of a society that encourages and rewards unreliable, hypocritical behavior.
Thank you, Ayala. It's a great question. Hypocrisy is Arendt argues against sort of the hunt for hypocrites in a political sense, right? In a number of places, and to some degree, what you'll say about hypocrites relates, I think, a bit to what you'll say about prejudices in this book, which is that we're all to some degree hypocrites, and we're all some degree prejudiced, and you can't get rid. And the political hunt for hypocrisy, or to wipe out hypocrisy, is deeply dangerous. Similarly, in this book, she'll say the political effort to simply punish or deny prejudices is politically dangerous as well as ineffective. And so, I'm not yet ready to sort of say hypocrisy and prejudices go together. I don't think they do. I think they're different. But your hypothesis, or your supposition that philosophy and the way Arendt is talking about it is in some way, in my words, I'm trying to take what you said, a non-political response, a non-violent, and thus, not a hunt for hypocrites, not a wiping out of prejudices, but a different kind of response to the unreliability of people, both as hypocrites and as prejudices, is not, I think, is at least worth thinking about. She doesn't use the word cure here. I used that maybe inadvertently, I don't know. But she does use the word improve, right? I think that philosophy, insofar as it can make us aware of both our singular insight, that's our divinity of some sort, our particular singular connection to an absolute, but hold that open and counter our tendencies towards orthodoxy or truth, and make us paralyze and think before we act or in our actions, is, I think, what Arendt has in mind. And she says that will improve us as citizens and persons. Not educate us, not cure us. I think cure was, I was trying to put it in other words, and that may have been inadvertent, but to make us more reliable, and to our, in our commitment to ourselves and to our ideals.
I think it gives us an opportunity. It gives an opportunity that of those who are seeking that opportunity. to improve and to work on those certainty. But that's where it stops. Yeah,
I agree. We're done with time. I have a little time today, so I will continue to answer the questions people have. But if anyone needs to go, I completely understand. And we'll see you next week. We're going to read the tradition of political thought. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and thank you all very much. But I will stick around and take questions. So Nick, if you still want to stick around, happy to take your question. But bye to anyone who needs to go. I understand people need to go.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I like very much the Arendt's idea here that we are prepared to live in a plural society by being ourselves plural. And the discussion so far that has gone on here is that this talking to oneself allows us to be, I guess, to resolve consistency within ourselves and to resolve that contradiction. The contradiction has been emphasized again and again in our thinking because we want to be pure and consistent within ourselves. The plurality within ourselves also solves the problem of gyges, I guess, in that if I do wrong and nobody knows, I can live with myself. As long as, but if I, as a murderer and nobody knowing, I still cannot live with myself because, but I think this discussion, I think when I think of this plurality, I think in this case is better served to think about who is the other self that I'm talking to. Because when I think of something about the other self as being consistent with myself, then I get into this contradiction thing. But when I think of that other self as being perhaps a proxy for other people, in other words, what I'm suggesting is that I have that capability, all of us, to put ourselves into another person's shoes, into another person's thinking, then everything that she says to me makes sense and is more palatable. Because whenever I argue, even and think, I'm also rather thinking about what the other person would say or think, and I can adjust my argument so. But even more important, I can build a friendship when I think of putting myself into that other person, and we can create a relationship and a political environment of growing. So rather than emphasis of being true to oneself, which she does talk about in this, I would have wished her to kind of talk about that other self being the other person and be more of a kind of a Humean and Adam Smith type mirroring of the other person. And that allows us to bridge the gap and to resolve hypocrisy and all these other problems at the same time, be in a political world. That would be my only comment.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I mean, I'll take it as a comment. I mean, she certainly wants to embrace the plurality of others who disagree. I think that's a big part of this. But I think she's also asking the question of to what extent philosophy can actually help people who do disagree. I hesitate to use the word better, but as she says, improve. I think it's fair. And in better and improve means not in any way against plurality, and yet for each one of us to be more true to ourselves in our singularity and thus our difference. How?
Yeah,
How?
no, my question was insofar as Arendt believes that I know that she's discussed the idea of, I'm not sure if she's like, she's not necessarily a fan of like the liberal form of democracy, or she believes that that citizens individually should take a more active role. She's a fan of like the town meeting. Does she believe then that this is a task, the task of, quote, you used this phrase earlier, making all men of affairs more open to questioning. Do you think this is just part of her wider belief that human beings just engaged in society, and this seems to me, at least from attending several of these, that her goal is just to get people to think more, like in other words, think about what they're doing? That's what she, so there's no contradiction in like,
I mean, I can say yes, but then I could also ask you mean by when you say just think what they were doing, because I don't think thinking is easy.
Well, isn't that part of her point? Is that thinking is easy?
Is easy? No, I don't think her point
No, I
is
said
that.
isn't that part of her point that thinking is not easy?
Right. So
In our
it's not
society.
just thinking, and I think thinking requires really holding yourself up to yourself, both on both who yourself is and on are you reliable to that self, and those are very challenging and difficult practices.
Yeah, that's my second thing is where does the self come? Because it's really hard to tell, like if she believes that every single person is kind of possessed with this self, where does that come from? I think I asked that.
Yeah. It comes from well, there's a number of answers to that, Hal. The easiest answer I can give you is that's what solitude is, at least an opportunity to engage in. In solitude, I can think with myself and begin to ask who I am. Am I, what does it mean for me to seek to live a meaningful life? So thinking is about meaning. How do I imagine myself living a meaningful life? And to the extent I get caught up in any other things, right? Liberalism, conservatism, Black Lives Matter, religion, whatever, I risk moving away from my sense of meaning, doke moi, and simply, accepting something given to me. And so it's in solitude. Now I may in solitude embrace my identity as a Jew, or as an intellectual, or as a reader of Hannah Arendt, or whatever it is. But in that solitude, I have the time to think about what is meaningful in my life and who I am. And it's in that solitude that I seek to ask, and at least to some degree answer the question of know thyself. Who am I? And that's not something that most people do, and according to Hannah Arendt, and it's not something that is easy, and it requires solitude, and it requires a kind of freedom from conventions and social norms, and it will be prejudicial, and because we all have prejudices in ourselves, and yet, so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, once I develop an idea of who I am as a meaningful person, what does it mean to live up to that, to act in accord with, liable in that regard, and that's the sort of second step of how philosophy can be meaningful and useful in the world for her, in the sense that philosophers, insofar as they are philosophers, can guide people and help people to ask these two questions.
So
I'm getting
a person builds themselves then? Because otherwise, I mean, because you kind of said a person is based on reflection in solitude, but they have to be reflecting on something. So is it things that then people pick and choose to be part of themselves, or sort of allow into this solitude?
I think everyone's different. you know, I mean, what is it? Very few of us today have this kind of solitude that she's talking about.
Or time.
Or time. Well, solitude includes time. And it includes not being around other opinions and other, you know, technologies and beeps and chimes.
How can somebody not be around other opinions? I guess, I mean, if you're alone in your car.
Well, you could be in a crowd. You know, I mean, the sort of image that she evokes, and here somewhat tangentially, is the image of Socrates walking down the street on the way to the symposium and stopping and standing there for 6 or 10 hours, I forget how long, and just being lost in thought for hours and hours, and paying attention to nobody as he thinks. You know, you don't have to be in your car or on a mountain. You can be walking down the street and just tune it all out. And
just thinking it's based on something. How can you avoid other people's opinions from coming into your thoughts?
Well, I mean, obviously you can't avoid everything, right? That's the whole point, is we all have prejudices. None of us are a blank slate. We start somewhere. But what Arendt is saying is that each of us, if we allow ourselves, has our own singular perspective. None of us are the same. You know, people today want to be whatever, Jewish or Christian or Muslim, or they want to be white or black or Asian or whatever. And you know, from Arendt's point of view, you know, all of those are meaningful in some way, and yet none of them encompass our singularity. And so to a certain degree, she's calling for a real difficult resistance to all of those kind of settled identities, and asking ourselves, what am I? What do I think? You know, this is a bit of far field, but long before I ever wrote about Hannah Arendt, and in a paper that I've never published, but in some work I've done, I used to teach the Republic a lot as a full semester course. And, you know, Glaucon, in asking Socrates to you know, tell him what justice is, Socrates keeps resisting it, keeps saying, no, I'm not going to tell you. And I'd have to go back, and it's been a while since I did this work, but at some point Socrates says, all right, I'm not going to tell you, but I'm going to show you how to see it for yourself. And here's a reading of Plato that I think is actually quite counter to Arendt's reading of Plato, but is actually quite in line with Arendt's own thinking.
So it's like so the argument's more like, and Arendt thinks maybe philosophy's job is to basically, instead of teach people what to think, teach people how to think.
Yes,
so like
very much.
The give a man a fish, teach a man to fish argument, I guess, maybe.
Yes, but teach them how to think, but that means teach them how to have wonder and to avoid both truths and orthodoxies. Yeah. And to think for themselves. Selbstdenken, as she says, which is really the hardest thing to do. But that's what I think this essay is about. Yeah. I think that's everyone who's had a question. So thank you all very much for sticking around, and I look forward to reading with you next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much, guys.